Hello and welcome back to another reading of Emma by Jane Austen. I'm going to go back to a little bit of a soft whisper, so let me know if that works or if you liked something else. And let's get on with the reading. While they were thus comfortably occupied, Mr. Woodhouse was enjoying a full flow of happy regrets and fearful affection with his daughter. "My poor dear Isabella," said he, fondly taking her hand and interrupting, for a few moments, her busy labours for some one of her 5 children. "How long it is, how terribly long since you were here, and how tired you must be after your journey. You must go to bed early, my dear, and I recommend a little gruel to you before you go. You and I will have a nice basin of gruel together. My dear Emma, suppose we all have a little gruel?" Emma could not suppose any such thing, knowing, as she did, that both the Mr. Knightleys were as unpersuadable on that article as herself, and the 2 basins were only were ordered. After a little more discourse in praise of gruel, with some wondering at its not being taken every evening by everybody, he proceeded to say, with an air of grave reflection, "It was an awkward business, my dear, your spending the autumn at Southend instead of coming here. I never had such much of an opinion of the sea air." Mr. Wingfield most strenuously recommended it, sir, or we should have not gone. He recommended it for all the children, but particularly for the weakness in little Bella's throat, both sea and air and bathing. "Oh, my dear, but Perry had many doubts about the sea doing her any good, and as to myself, I have been long perfectly convinced, though perhaps I never told you before, that the sea is very rarely of any use to anybody. I am sure it almost killed me once." "Come, come," cried Emma, feeling this to be an unsafe subject, "I must beg you do not talk of the sea. It makes me envious and miserable, I who have never seen it. Southend is prohibited, if you please. My dear Isabella, I have not heard you make one inquiry after Mr. Perry yet, and he never forgets you." "Oh, good Mr. Perry, how is he, sir?" "Why, pretty well, but not quite well. Poor Perry is bilious, and he has not had time to take care of himself. He tells me he has not had time to, which is very sad, but he is always wanted all round the country. I suppose there is not a man in such practice anywhere, but then there is not so clever a man anywhere. And Mrs. Perry and the children, how are they? Do the children grow? I have a great regard for Mr. Perry. I hope you will be calling soon. You'll be so pleased to see my little ones. I hope you will be here tomorrow, for I have a question or 2 to ask him about myself of some consequence. And my dear, whenever he comes, you had better let him look at little Bella's throat. Oh, my dear sir, her throat is so much better that I have hardly any unease about it. Either bathing has been of greatest service to her, or else it is to be attributed to an excellent imprecation of Mr. Wingfield's, which we have been applying at times ever since August. It is not very likely, my dear, that bathing should have been of use to her, and if I had known you were wanting an imprecation, I would have spoken to you. You seem to me to have forgotten Mr. and Mrs. Bates," said Emma. "I have not heard one inquiry about them." "Oh, the good Bates! I am quite ashamed of myself, but you mention them in the most of your letters. I hope they are quite well. Good old Mrs. Bates, I will call upon her tomorrow and take my children. They are always so pleased to see my children, and that excellent Miss Bates, such thorough worthy people. How are they, sir?" "Why, pretty well, my dear, upon the whole, but poor Mrs. Bates has had a bad cold about a month ago. How sorry I am, but colds were never so prevalent as they have been this autumn. Mr. Wingfield told me that he has never known them more general or heavy, except when it has been quite an influenza. That has been a good deal the case, my dear, but not to the degree you mention. Perry says that colds have not been very general, but not so heavy, as he has very often known them in November. Perry does not call it altogether sickly season. No? I do not know that Mr. Wingfield considers it very sickly, except, my poor dear child. The truth is that in London it is always a sickly season. Nobody is healthy in London. Nobody can be. It is a dreadful thing to be forced to live there, so far off, and the air so bad. No, indeed, we are not at all with bad air. Our part of London is so very superior to most others. You must not confound us with London in general, my dear sir. The neighbourhood of Brunswick Square is very different from almost all the rest. We are so very airy. I should be unwillingly, I own, to live in any other part of town. There is hardly any other that I could be satisfied to have my children in. But we are so remarkably airy. Mr. Wingfield thinks the vicinity of Brunswick Square decidedly the most favourable as to air. My dear, it is not like Hartfield. You make the best of it, but after you've been a week at Hartfield, you are all of you different creatures. You do not look like the same. Now, I cannot say that I think you are any of you looking well at present. I am sorry to hear you say so, sir, but I assure you, expecting those little nervous headaches and palpitations which I am never entirely free from, I am quite well myself, and if the children were rather pale before they went to bed, it was only because they were a little more tired than usual from their journey and the happiness of coming. I hope you will all think better of their looks tomorrow, for I assure you Mr. Wingfield told me that he did not believe he had ever sent us off altogether in such good case. I trust, at least, that you do not think Mr. Knightley looking ill? Turning her eyes with affectionate anxiety towards her husband. Middling, my dear, I cannot compliment you. I think Mr. John Knightley very far from looking well. What is the matter, sir? Did you speak to me? Cried Mr. John Knightley, hearing his own name. I am sorry to find, my love, that my father does not think you look well, but I hope it is from being a little fatigued. I could have wished, however, as you know, that you had seen Mr. Wingfield before you left home. My dear Isabella, exclaimed he hastily, pray do not concern yourself about my looks. Be satisfied with doctoring and coddling yourself and the children, and let me look as I choose. I did not thoroughly understand what you were telling your brother, cried Emma, but your friend Mr. Graham intending to have a bailiff from Scotland to look after his new estate. But will it answer? Will not the old prejudice be too strong? And she talked in this way for so long and successfully that when forced to give her attention again to her father and sister, she had nothing worse to hear than Isabella's kind injury after Jane Fairfax. And Jane Fairfax, though no great favourite with her in general, she was at the moment very happy to assist in praising. That sweet, amiable Jane Fairfax, said Mrs. John Knightley. It is so long since I have seen her, except now and then for a moment accidentally in town. What happiness it must be to her, old grandmother and excellent aunt, when she comes to visit them. I always regret excessively on dear Emma's account that she cannot be more at Highbury, but now their daughter is married, I suppose Connell and Mrs. Campbell will not be able to part with her at all. She would be such a delight companion for Emma. Mr. Woodhouse agreed to it all, but added, our little friend Harriet Smith, however, is just such another pretty kind of a young person. You will like Harriet. Emma could not have a better companion than Harriet. I am most happy to hear it, but only Jane Fairfax one knows to be so very accomplished and superior, and exactly Emma's age. This topic was discussed very happily, and others succeeded of similar moment, and passed away with similar harmony, but the evening did not close without a little return of agitation. The quarrel came and supplied a great deal to be said, much praised and many comments, undoubting decisions of its wholesomeness for every constitution, and pretty severe philippics upon the many houses where it was never met with tolerable tolerable, but unfortunately, among the failures which the daughters had to instance, the most recent and therefore most prominent was in her own cook at Southend, a young woman hired for the time, who never had been able to understand what she meant by a basin of nice smooth gruel, thin but not too thin. Often as she had wished for and ordered it, she had never been able to get anything tolerable. Here was a dangerous opening. "Ah," said Mr. Woodhouse, shaking his head and fixing his eyes on her with tender concern. The ejaculation in Emma's ear expressed, "Ah, there is no end of the sad consequences of your going to Southend. It does not bear talking of." And for a little while she hoped he would not talk of it, and that a silent lamentation might suffice to restore him to the relish of his own smooth gruel. After an interval of some minutes, however, he began with, "I shall always be very sorry that you went to the sea this autumn instead of coming here. But why would you be sorry, sir? I assure you it did the children a great deal of good. And moreover, if you must go to the sea, you had better not have been to Southend. Southend is an unhealthy place. Perry was surprised to hear you had fixed upon Southend. I know there is such an idea with many people, but indeed it is quite a mistake, sir. We all had our health perfectly well there, never found the least inconvenience from the mud, and Mr. Wingfield said it is entirely a mistake to suppose the place unhealthy. I am sure he may be depended on, for he thoroughly understands the nature of the air, and his own brother and family have been there repeatedly. You should have gone to Cromer, my dear, if you went anywhere. Perry was a week at Cromer once, and he holds it to be the best of all the sea-bathing places. A fine open sea, he says, and very pure air, and by what I understand, you might have had lodgings there quite away from the sea, a quarter of a mile off, very comfortable. You should have consulted Perry. But my dear sir, the difference of the journey, only consider how great it would have been, 100 miles perhaps instead of 40. Ah, my dear, as Perry said, where health is at stake, nothing else should be considered. And if one is to travel, there is not much to choose between 40 and 100. Better not move at all, and better stay in London altogether than travel 40 miles to get into a worser air. This is just what Perry said. It seemed to him a very ill-judged measure. Emma's attempt to stop her father had been vain, and when he had reached such a point as this, she could not wonder at her brother-in-law's breathing out. "Mr. Perry," said he, in a voice of very strong displeasure, "would you do as well to keep his opinion till it is asked for? Why does he make it any business of his to wonder at what I do, at my taking my family to one part of the coast or another? I may be allowed, I hope, the use of my judgment, as well as Mr. Perry. I want his directions no more than his drugs." He paused, and growing cooler in a moment, added, with only a sarcastic dryness, "If Mr. Perry can tell me how to convey a wife and 5 children a distance of 130 miles with no greater expense or inconvenience than a distance of 40, I should be as willing to prefer Cromer to Southend as he could himself." "True, true," cried Mr. Knightley, with most ready interposition. "Very true, that's a consideration indeed. But, John, as to what I was telling you of my idea of moving the path to Langham, of turning it more to the right, then it may not cut through the home meadows. I cannot conceive any difficulty. I should not attempt it, if it were to be the means of inconvenience to the Highbury people. But you call to mind exactly the present line of the path. The only way of proving it, however, will be to turn to our maps. I shall see you at the Abbey tomorrow morning, I hope, and then we will look them over, and you shall give me your opinion." Mr. Woodhouse was rather agitated by such harsh reflections on his friend Perry, to whom he had in fact, though unconsciously, been attributing many of his own feelings and expressions. But the soothing attentions of his daughters gradually removed the present evil, and the immediate alertness of one brother, and better recollections of the other, prevented any renewal of it. There could hardly be a happier creature in the world than Mrs. John Knightley. In this short visit to Hartfield, going about every morning among her old acquaintance with her 5 children and talking over what she had done every evening with her father and sister. She had nothing to wish otherwise, but that the days did not pass so swiftly. It was a delightful visit, perfect in being much too short. In general, their evenings were less engaged with friends than their mornings, but one complete dinner engagement, and out of the house too, there was no avoiding, though at Christmas. Mr. Weston would take no denial they must all dine at Randall's one day. Even Mr. Woodhouse was persuaded to think it a possible thing in preference to a division of the party. How they were all to be conveyed he would have made a difficulty if he could. But as his son and daughter's carriage and horses were actually at Hartfield, he was not able to make more than a simple question on that head. It hardly amounted to a doubt, nor did it occupy Emma's long to convince him that there might be in one of the carriages find room for Harriet also. Harriet, Mr. Elton, and Mr. Knightley, their own special set, were the only persons invited to meet them. The hours were to be early, as well as the numbers few, Mr. Woodhouse's habits and inclination being consulted in everything. The evening before this great event had been spent by Harriet at Hartfield, and she had gone home so much indisposed with a cold that but for her own earnest wish of being nursed by Mrs. Goddard, Emma could have not allowed her to leave the house. Emma called on her the next day, and found her doom already signed with regard to Randall's. She was very feverish and had a bad sore throat. Mrs. Goddard was full of care and affection. Mr. Perry was talked of, and Harriet herself was too ill and too old to resist the authority which excluded her from the delightful engagement, though she could not speak of her loss without many tears. Emma sat with her as long as she could, to attend her in Mrs. Goddard's unavoidable absences, and raise her spirits by representing how much Mr. Elton's would be depressed when he knew her state, and left her at last tolerably comfortable in the sweet dependence of his having a most comfortless visit, and of all their missing her very much. She had not advanced many hours from Mrs. Goddard's door when she was met by Mr. Elton himself, evidently coming towards it, and as they walked on slowly together in conversation about the invalid, of whom he, on the rumour of considerable illness, had been going to inquire that he might carry some report of her to Hartfield, they were overtaken by John Knightley, returning from the daily visit to Donwell, with his 2 eldest boys, whose healthy, glowing faces shewed all the benefit of a country run, and seemed to ensure a quick dispatch of the roast mutton and rice pudding they were hastening home for. They joined company and proceeded together. Emma was just describing the nature of her friend's complaint, her throaty very much inflamed, with a great deal of heat about her, a quick low pulse, and she was sorry to find Mrs. Goddard that Harriet was liable to very bad sore throats, and had often alarmed her with them. Mr. Elton looked all alarmed on the occasion as he exclaimed, "A sore throat? I hope not infectious. I hope not of a purulent infectious sort. Has Perry seen her? Indeed, you should take care of yourself as well as your friend. Let me entreat you to run no risks. Why does Perry not see her?" Emma, who was not really at all frightened herself, tranquillized this excessive apprehension by assurances of Mrs. Goddard's experience and care. But as there must still remain a degree of uneasiness which she could not wish to reason away, which she would rather feed and assist than not, she added soon afterwards, as if quite another subject, "It is so cold, so very cold, and looks and feels so very much like snow, that if it were any other place or any other property, I should really try not to go out today, and dissuade my father from venturing. But as he has made up his mind and does not seem to feel the cold himself, I do not like to interfere, as I know it would be so great a disappointment to Mr. and Mrs. Weston. But upon my word, Mr. Elton, in your case, I should certainly excuse myself. You will appear to me a little hoarse already, And when you consider what demand of voice and what fatigues tomorrow will bring, I think it would be no more than common prudence to stay at home and take care of yourself tonight. Mr. Elton looked as if he did not very well know what answer to make, which was exactly the case, for though very much gratified by the kind care of such a fair lady, and not liking to resist any advice of hers, he had not really the least inclination to give up the visit. But Emma, too eager and busy in her own previous conceptions and views to hear him impartially or see him with a clear vision, was very well satisfied with his muttering acknowledgment of its being very cold, certainly very cold, and walked on, rejoicing in having extricated him from Randall's and secure him the power of sending to inquire after Harriet every hour of the evening. "You do quite right," said she. "We will make your apologies to Mr. and Mrs. Weston." But hardly had she so spoken, when she found her brother was civilly offering a seat in this carriage, if the weather were Elton's only objection, and Mr. Elton actually accepting the offer with much prompt satisfaction. It was a done thing. Mr. Elton was to go, and never had his broad, handsome face more pleasure than at this moment. Never had his smile been stronger, nor his eyes more exulting than when he next looked at her. "Well," said she to herself, "this is most strange. After I had got him off so well, to choose to go into company and leave Harriet ill behind. Most strange indeed, but there is, I believe, in many men, especially single men, such an inclination, such a passion for dining out. A dinner engagement is so high in the class of their pleasures, their employments, their dignities, almost their duties, that anything gives away to it. This must be the case with Mr. Elton, a most valuable, amiable, pleasing young man, undoubtedly, and very much in love with Harriet. But still, he cannot refuse an invitation. He must dine out wherever he is asked. What a strange thing love is. He can see ready wit in Harriet, but will not dine alone for her." Soon afterwards Mr. Elton quitted them, and she could not but do him the justice of feeling that there was a great deal of sentiment in his manner of naming Harriet at parting, in the tone of his voice, while assuring her that he should call at Mrs. Goddard's for news of her fair friend, the last thing before he prepared for the happiness of meeting her again, when he hoped to be able to give a better report, and he sighed and smiled himself off in a way that left the balance of approbation much in his favour. After a few minutes of entire silence between them, John Knightley began with, "I never in my life saw a man more intent on being agreeable than Mr. Elton. It is downright labour to him where ladies are concerned. With men he can be rational and unaffected, but when he has ladies to please, every feature works." "Mr. Elton's manners are not perfect," replied Emma, "but where there is a wish to please, one ought to overlook, and one does overlook a great deal. Where a man does his best with only moderate powers, he will have the advantage over negligent superiority. There is such perfect good temper and good will in Mr. Elton as one cannot but value." "Yes," said John Knightley presently, with some slyness, "he seems to have a great deal of good will towards you." "Me?" she replied with a smile of astonishment. "Are you imagining me to be Mr. Elton's object?" "Such an imagination has crossed me, I own, Emma, and if it never occurred to you before, you may as well take it into consideration now. Mr. Elton in love with me! What an idea! I do not say it is so, but you will do well to consider whether it is so or not, and to regulate your behaviour accordingly. I think your manners to him encouraging. I speak as a friend, Emma. You had better look about you, and ascertain what you do and what you mean to do." "I thank you, but I assure you you are quite mistaken. Mr. Elton and I are very good friends, and nothing more." She walked on, amusing herself in the consideration of this blunders which often arise from a partial knowledge of circumstances, of the mistakes which people of high pretensions to judgment are forever falling into, and not very well pleased with her brother for imagining her blind and ignorant, and in want of counsel, he said no more. Mr. Woodhouse had so completely made up his mind to the visit, that in spite of the increasing coldness, he seemed to have no idea of the shrinking from it, and set forward at last most punctually with his eldest daughter in his own carriage, with less apparent consciousness of the weather than either of the others, too full of the wonder of his own going, and the pleasure it was to afford at Randalls, to see that it was cold, and too well wrapped up to feel it. The cold, however, was severe. By the time the second carriage was in motion, a few flakes of snow were finding their way down, and the sky had the appearance of being so overcharged as to want only a milder air to produce a very white world in a very short time. Emma soon saw that her companion was not in the happiest humour. The prepping and the going abroad in such weather, with sacrifice of his children after dinner, were evils, or disagreeable at least, which Mr. John Knightley did not by any means like. He anticipated nothing in the visit that could be at all worth the purchase, and the whole of their drive to the vicarage was spent by him in expressing his discontent. "A man," said he, "must have a very good opinion of himself, when he asks people to leave their own fireside and encounter such a day as this, for the sake of coming to see him. He must think himself a most agreeable fellow. I could not do such a thing. It is the greatest absurdity, actually snowing at this moment, the folly of not allowing people to be comfortable at home, and the folly of people's not staying comfortably at home when they can. If we were obliged to go out on such an evening as this, by any call of duty or business, what a hardship we should deem it. And here we are, probably with rather thinner clothing than usual, setting forward voluntarily, without excuse, in defiance of the voice of nature, which tells man, in everything given to his view or his feelings, to stay at home himself and keep all under shelter that he can. Here are we setting forward to spend 5 dull hours in another man's house, with nothing to say or to hear that was not said and heard yesterday, and may not be said and heard again tomorrow, going in dismal weather, to return probably in worse, 4 horses and 4 servants taken out for nothing but to convey 5 idle, shivering creatures into colder rooms and worse company than they might have had at home." Emma did not find herself equal to give the pleased assent, which no doubt he was in the habit of receiving, to emulate the "very true, my love," which must have usually been administered by his travelling companion, but she had resolution enough to refrain from making any answer at all. She could not be complying. She dreaded being quarrelsome. Her heroism reached only to silence. She allowed him to talk, and arranged the glasses, and wrapped herself up without opening her lips. They arrived, the carriage turned, the step was let down, and Mr. Elton, spruce, black and smiling, was with them instantly. Emma thought with pleasure of some change of subject. Mr. Elton was all obligation and cheerfulness. He was so very cheerful in his civilities indeed, that she began to think he must have received a different account of Harriet from what had reached her. She had sent while dressing, and the answer had been much the same, not better. "My report from Mrs. Goddard's," said she presently, "was not so pleasant as I had hoped." "Not better," was my answer. His face lengthened immediately, and his voice was the voice of sentiment as he answered, "Oh no, I am grieved to find. I was on the point of telling you that when I called at Mrs. Goddard's door, which I did the very last thing before I returned to dress, I was told that Miss Smith was not better, by no means better, rather worse, very much grieved and concerned. I had flattered myself that she must be better after such a cordial as I knew had given her in the morning." Emma smiled and answered, "My visit was of use to the nervous part of her complaint, I hope, but not even I can charm away a sore throat. It is a most severe cold indeed. Mr. Perry had been with her, as you probably have heard,